Welcome to this Asia Global Podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. Subscribe to Asia Global Online, our weekly digital journal, by going to the Asia Global Online or the Asia Global Institute website. And follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Our topic is pretty simple in this episode. It's India, which recently marked 75 years since independence. So we are joined from the Washington area, really from the great state of Maryland in the United States, by Vasuki Shastry, an old friend of mine. We did a lot of work together in the past. Vasuki is Associate Fellow in the Asia Pacific program of Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He is the author of Has Asia Lost It? Dynamic Past, Turbulent Future, a fantastic book, which I really recommend to you, published in March 2021 by World Scientific. He began his professional career as a journalist in his native India and then in Singapore and in Southeast Asia. He has since held senior positions in communications and public affairs at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, and Standard Chartered Bank. I believe he was based in London when he was working for Standard Chartered. And he was the global head of public affairs and sustainability there until November 2018. His book, Resurgent Indonesia, From Crisis to Confidence, another fantastic book, by the way, was published by Straits Times Press in 2018. So Vasuki, it's really lovely to see you.
Delighted to be here, Al, as always.
Yeah. Not long ago, we saw each other in person, so it's funny to kind of regress back into the Zoom box, but it's really lovely, really wonderful to see you. So let's talk about India. India's just marked, as I mentioned, 75 years since 1947 and independence from Britain. What Nehru called redemption from a tryst with destiny. So the nation has been described in different ways by different people. Churchill called it a geographical term, no more a United Nations than the equator. Lee Kuan Yew didn't really think of it as a real country. Instead, he said it is 32 separate nations that happen to be arrayed along the British rail line. Galbraith, the economist who was the American ambassador to India at one time, called it a functioning anarchy. And some have really referred to India as an idea, the idea of India. So, Vasuki, how would you describe the India that you know? What to you is the meaning of that idea?
When I think about India's 75th anniversary of independence, I think it's a moment to celebrate, it's a moment to reflect, and it's a moment to despair. But let me not be the negative Nelly in this proceeding, and let's talk a little bit about celebration. And I really, looking back, I've been just like you, reading up a lot on India's famous independence moment of 1947. And I must say, I really am in awe of the sheer audacity of the founding fathers, Gandhi, Nehru, Sardar Patel, and that generation which fought for independence. I think, one milestone would have been simply the Declaration of Independence in August 1947. And that alone, I think, would have been a huge moment of celebration. But the fact that India's founding fathers, made some radical choices for that time and radical choices when you look back, really that this would be a democracy, secularism would be one of the founding principles, that all religions would be accepted and would have a space in modern India. The fact that they built a constitution, the architecture of that constitution is in the sheer diversity of India at that time and India certainly of today.
Right.
And I think, one can just marvel at the farsightedness and the vision of that founding generation. And of course, so these two building blocks, fighting for independence and then articulating a vision for India of what kind of democracy it is going to be, what kind of inclusive space it is going to have for all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, and ethnicity. I think that has really held India in good stead until very recently.
Right.
So 75th anniversary, great moment to celebrate. And if there's any country out there, and there aren't that many countries under colonial rule today, but any country wants to fashion a democracy out of its messy diversity, I think India still remains an abiding model of that.
Right. I think it's interesting, to mark an independence, for a country that in many ways is a civilization, really, is more about people, and that this is one of the things that I was thinking about, like how important really is it to kind of celebrate an independence when you're talking about a great culture, a great people, a great many cultures really that are part of what we think of as the nation of India. What do you think then of the importance? Because that essentially, by marking independence, you're saying that was the end of colonial rule. So there must have been some significance of that in terms of the British actual departure. What did they leave behind? What did they leave undone? What did they mess up? Right? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think there's an entire industry out there which is rethinking British colonial rule. Certainly, Shashi Tharoor is at the forefront of that. I think linked with this is the notion, and that's very much alive in India today, of the wonder that was India until 10th century AD, when India was certainly at the center of the world. We had all of these fabulous collection of kingdoms, which spoke to India's enormous wealth, prestige, and influence at that time. So when many Indians look back at Independence Day, certainly they look back at 1,000 years of servitude, the fact that you had the succession of foreign invaders, the British being the most recent of those. And that this debate is very alive in India today, and indeed the BJP government's efforts to re-engineer Indian history really is aimed at saying that we need to go back and try to capture that golden past in the India that is today. And of course, this is a lot to do with identity politics and nativism, which I hope we can discuss later. But again, the question of the impact of British colonial rule, I think for many decades after independence, I mean, I was in a conversation with a member of the family recently who was 5 or 6 years old on Independence Day. And I was asking him, what do you remember from that era? And obviously he was too young to remember Independence Day. But he said that King George V's passing in India in the early 1950s, the Times of India, the leading newspaper of that day and certainly of today, had a black border front page announcing the death of the king. So India had very much had this very ambivalent attitude towards the colonial Raj. On one hand, very proud that independence had been achieved. On the other hand, not reflecting too much about the British balance sheet of colonial rule. That debate has squarely come back in recent decades. I think there's greater conversations in India on the impact of colonial rule, and certainly this conversation is threaded together with issues in other countries that also achieved independence from British rule. So there is almost like a network, an ecosystem of colonial era analysts who are looking at the ills and the benefits of British colonial rule.
But is there a political correctness side to this, in the sense that can one still talk about the benefits of colonial rule, or has it become more the political correctness position to say, well, we need to focus on the ills and the negative side of it?
Yeah, having lived in London, I completely agree that the benefits part of this equation. I mean, in London, you've got an entire ruling class which is still living off the imperial era glories, and who certainly look at colonial rule as being benign and beneficial to the native subjects. So, of course, one must reject that hypothesis upfront, because the simple objective of colonial rule, be it the British, be it the French, was really extraction of resources, was subjugation of the local population, and whatever benefits that may have yielded by way of the infamous or famous railway network in India was accidental, and mainly was built to move colonial era goods and the wheels of commerce in the direction of London, rather than trying to build this domestic economic base. In India of today, I think the new generation, of course, they're far removed from many decades of British rule, right? So they don't have a familiarity beyond what they have read in textbooks. This has enabled the government of today to really refashion the issue of national identity based on the fact. So they're re-engineering history by essentially saying that era of founding fathers, the secular basis of India in 1947 was simply flawed. They were a group of right-wing fundamentalists whose voices were not heard at that era. So there's a movement happening today to try and rewrite some of that history, which you have a susceptible younger generation. I mean, India's young population is 55% of the country's population today. So there is a risk that the wrong lessons are going to be learned.
That's an interesting, just to draw parallels from my own experience in the Philippines, because one thing that the Philippines shares with India is that youth bulge, is that youthful demographic. And we've just seen in the Philippines, a leader with a familiar name take over as president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And those of us of a certain age, of course, remember his father, Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, who really brought the country to its knees and then was run out of town in 1986. But in some ways, the return of the Marcoses has a lot to do with, dare I say, manipulation of the narrative, right? Of what that period of his father's rule was like, and so those who control that narrative, in other words, probably can control the power. It would seem, at least that's the lesson that some of us in the Philippines are taking. So let's talk a bit about that in the case of India today. You've already mentioned the identity politics. What is the identity politics? How is that playing out? Because it does seem to be not only creating a narrative, but also creating a different kind of zeitgeist, if you will, kind of a different outlook for the nation. And I think disappointing some and exciting others, right? So what is the dynamics of this identity politics?
I think first, this government is secure in the majority that it has in parliament, and let's admit it, this government enjoys the support of a vast majority of India's electorate. And one should not deny that, right? So this is a government which is built on public support. It seems like majority of the public are also supportive of the kind of identity politics which the government is promoting. And part of this is to rewrite, I mean, you spoke about historical narratives. Part of this enterprise is to rewrite historical narratives of how India gained independence, who those prominent founders were. So there is a not so subtle effort, for example, today to completely erase Nehru's contributions, both to the freedom movement as well as his 16, 17 years tenure as prime minister. So, and they're trying to completely erase Nehru from the picture and building this alternative narrative, which, majority of young people who are unfamiliar with history are likely to be susceptible to, that there was always a strong Hindu ideology governing Indian politics. It was suppressed by people such as Nehru, who really took India off in a very completely wrong direction. And indeed, there's a Bollywood movie actress who a few years ago mentioned that from her perspective, India only gained independence in 2014. That's when Mr. Modi came to power.
Right.
And before that, the independence was nominal, and it was all about hunger. It was all about poverty and hunger. I think this will have a profound impact on, everyone in India, including the Prime Minister, of course, celebrated the 75th anniversary of independence. But in doing so, they're trying to completely re-engineer this new narrative that this government came to power at a historical moment, and it is refashioning and rebuilding India in its true identity, rather than the secular era politics of the last 6 decades. Whether they succeed or not, I always think that whenever governments show greater certainty and confidence in undertaking these massive historical reconstruction, they eventually will be surprised by the electorate, right? So, I'm always hopeful that India, with all its complexity and chaos, although things do look grim today, purely from the perspective of identity part is one element of it. The fact that the Indian economy has also kind of lost its way also gives me hope that there will be a correction, there will be a political correction. And the Indian voters have always chosen wisely, and hopefully in the future, they will again choose wisely in bringing together a government that, there's no other way to govern India other than through diversity. That's my, abiding view on the country.
You've spoken about the reinterpreting of Nehru, right? What about Mohandas Gandhi, about Mahatma Gandhi? Because for outsiders, of course, he was almost pretty much synonymous with India. Has there also been a similar kind of reinterpretation of Gandhi and what he stood for?
Yeah, there's a more malign and subtle way by which Gandhi's reputation is being slowly being chipped away. That is by celebrating his assassin. So his assassin is somehow become a demigod in the eyes of hugely influential mainstream wing of the ruling party. But I think even the ruling party recognizes that while Nehru may be fair play, and Nehru may be fair play mainly because his descendants have been in positions of political power for a big chunk after independence, certainly his daughter Indira Gandhi and son Rajiv Gandhi. But in the case of Mohandas Gandhi himself, it is much more difficult to chip away at Gandhi's standing and reputation, because Gandhi himself was you know, how, I mean, the one way of looking at Gandhi is he would have been a social media troll in this era
Right.
because he was ubiquitous. He was completely audacious in the kind of politics that he practiced. It's going to be very difficult for right-wing India to wipe away Gandhi's legacy as they're attempting to do with Nehru. I mean, they may prop up this assassin as having done the right thing of having stopped India from appeasing the minority community. They're going to attempt all of that, but I think Gandhi's standing in the world, his relevance, his thinking and relevance in today's world makes it very hard for PM Modi to kind of push away Gandhi's legacy.
Now, you've already spoken about the concepts, if you will, that have been the foundation of India: democracy, liberalism, secularism, concern for the poor, and of course the changes that now have occurred in recent years. So what are you most concerned about? I mean, you already mentioned some of the things, but what are you most concerned about going forward? You know, the key challenges that India faces. I mean, you talked, in fact, about, well, you know, what are the choices for the electorate, right? But especially in the context of, again, something you've mentioned, the flagging economy, and indeed the pandemic, which brought out some of the deficiencies, if you will, in Indian society, the dysfunctions. And then, of course, we're seeing, as in many other countries, the impact of the Ukraine war economically. What are the kind of immediate challenges at this point?
Yeah, let me briefly come to the defense of the BJP.
Right.
I think India's democratic challenges predate this government being in power. And I think the Congress party should be equally blamed for years of misrule, for years of undermining democratic ideals, and on the economic side, the way I look at it, India has consistently snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. This is a country that should be thriving. I mean, this is a country that should be growing at 10%.
Right.
Should be reducing chronic poverty levels. Should be allowing the animal spirits which exist in the private sector. And Indian entrepreneurship is absolutely out there with the best in the world. But instead of and you know, so you have successive governments. So this is not just the BJP's fault alone, which have shackled the economy, shackled the political system, and the BJP is merely taking advantage of this unique position it's in of unquestioned majority rule. I happen to believe that India is ideally, India's diversity, chaos, complexity makes it ideal for coalition governments to function the best, where you have big tent politics, where you bring in, and indeed, I think if you look at India's most recent past, it is the coalition governments which have really pushed through economic reforms, social reforms, and political reforms. And the majority government in power, be it Congress or the BJP, seems content in consolidating political power. Right? So I think coalition politics is the best. And the fact that Mr. Modi has been able to build this, you know, commanding majority really demonstrates to their, you know, political skills, their success in rebuilding the narrative, right? But, you know, politics is very, very fluid. So one can't take it as a given that the status quo is going to last forever. So in terms of India's future, one has to worry about politics and polity. The fact that Indian politics has become, you know, very, very entrenched, very hard for newcomers to come in and make a difference. I know BJP folks will argue that Mr. Modi himself was a disruptive newcomer. But, you know, the fact that he was aligned with the RSS for many decades before simply. So this does not stand up to scrutiny. So, I mean, my question has always been, can they be a challenger? Like in Indonesia, where you had President Widodo, who literally came out of nowhere, a furniture salesman in a central Java town, uh, uh, you know, uh, through sheer political bravado, was able to become president. And by all accounts, I mean, I know every leader has a mixed record, but by all accounts, Jokowi has had a successful political career. Can that happen in India? Because India, I think, desperately needs fresh talent, and talent with political talent, which is younger, tends to skew younger compared with the gerontocrats who are running the country today. So that's one challenge. How do you open up the country's political system?
Which I think interesting. You deal about the gerontocracy in Asia in your book, which I think is a very interesting topic. Yeah, sorry.
So it's very hard. So you have Arvind Kejriwal of the Common Man's Party, who literally is the first political contender in the mainstream. And of course, Mr. Kejriwal is a scrappy fighter. He's quite unorthodox in many of his policies, and he's trying to build this national coalition. And we'll wait and see whether he indeed is going to be India's Jokowi. But at the same time, it's ossified. That political system is completely ossified. The second thing is, how do you build economic opportunity? I'm less concerned about under a sensible government and a finance minister, I think the Indian economy will thrive. But then there's a fundamental question of how do you open up economic opportunity? I think India's biggest success over the past decades is in bringing down absolute rates of poverty. Its biggest challenge for the next 2 or 3 decades is building social mobility, in making sure that you've got this vast underclass of the poor and lower middle class who want to make it up the economic ladder through education. So the question is, how can you create the jobs which will absorb this vast army, hundreds of millions of people who are looking to rise up the economic ladder, and that's going to be a challenge. And I think it's the inequality challenge, I would argue, is less stark compared with China, where China, you're also beginning to see mobility challenges amongst the youth. And I think India's political system, at the end of the day, is like a massive social shock absorber. So people can vent their grievance, and hopefully this government is not going to take away those rights. So building that economic opportunity, I would say, would be so if in the 1950s, India's profound challenge was reducing absolute poverty, the challenge in the 2020s and beyond is to build the engine of economic growth, which will enable everyone to prosper.
Interesting that you just to go back and when you talked about that, when you were arguing that coalition governments might be better suited to the system, but and then you think about the challenge of addressing inequality and bringing better quality, sustainable growth to the country, to the economy. There are those, of course, who look at China and say, well, China achieved this sort of high growth. Now, of course, it came with a great deal of inequality, at least now. But its development was really driven because, to a large extent, because it had that kind of strong authoritarian system that, whilst a big country and you had all these provinces, but the central government provided direction. And is that argument then? Is there an argument then for India where you say, well, the democracy can be its Achilles heel, and indeed coalition system might actually be more of an impediment than it could be a benefit. That as many Asian leaders have argued in the past, that in order to address these serious problems of economic problems, social problems, you need that stronger leadership, right? That more focused.
Yeah, I mean, India has a stronger leader now,
Right.
and you're not seeing, you're certainly seeing a lot of noise about rising India and shining India, but none of this data actually shows up in the statistics. And I think I think culture has a lot to do with it. I think coalition politics works best for a complicated country like India, because you bring in those diversity of voices, you build this big tent politics, and of course it can be very, very frustrating. And the first Congress government between 2004 and 2009, which in my view was along with the Congress government in the early 1990s and the BJP government in the late 1990s, were three of the most successful governments in recent Indian history. And two of them happen to be, in fact, all of them happen to be coalition governments, some more than the others. And a lot of business was able to get done. I mean, India's entire nuclear accord with the US, coming from being banished for the nuclear tests of 1998, was only possible under a coalition government where the far left parties assented to the dramatic change in direction in foreign policy that the government at the time was attempting to bring. And so you have heavy centralization and accumulation of power by Mr. Modi at this point in time, but it's not very evident that first is a question of what are you using that accumulation of power for. I mean, if you're using that accumulation of power to consolidate your identity-based politics, which is what seems to be happening, that's one issue. But if you're using that consolidation of power to get things done, to build the bridges, to build the roads, certainly infrastructure is being built in India today much more rapidly than say the last 2 decades. But it's still, and the fact that India is now receding, there's no reasonable chance of India catching up with China unless there's a dramatic change in economic direction, would suggest to me that you need to bring in more diverse voices into the picture and more decentralization of power away from Delhi.
So Vasuki, you built your career outside of India. So for much of your life, much of your professional life, you've been able to look at India from the outside. So how do you see India's role in the world then, particularly at this juncture, which seems to be a kind of important juncture in its history? Is it aspiring to be a global power, to be a kind of rival to China or even to the US? Or is it even, is it just will it be a regional power, just a regional hegemon, if you will? What kind of role is India aspiring to?
I don't think anyone in India would honestly admit that India has aspirations of being superpower, and certainly in terms of economic weight, in terms of the region it is in, I don't think India would ever want to put itself in the position. And India has had this long history of involvement, for example, in Afghanistan, more recently in Sri Lanka. And India seems, looking at it completely from the outside, seems very uncomfortable in this role of being a hegemon. Of course, they've been, India's smaller neighbors will say this country is a bully at times. And there, the relationship with, Even friendly countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal are fraught because, and India is nervous about China's growing incursion into the region. And I think so if you look at the economic yardstick by which a country aspires to regional power or superpower status, India is not there. And certainly its foreign policy footprint. I mean, India needs to recruit many thousands more of diplomats in order to expand, I think, its global reach and influence. I mean, the Indian foreign ministry is tiny by the number of diplomats it has compared with almost any other country of that size. So India is very cautious. It's very shy, and this has become very apparent both in the Russia-Ukraine context. I think more recently with the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, India could have, if it wanted to needle China, with whom it has this really, really messy border conflict underway, could have needled China by signing on to that Quad statement, expressing concern about, but India chose not to, which really suggests to me that while India will be enthusiastic in being supportive of regional initiatives like the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is quite happy to be aligned with Washington, D.C. in expanding defense cooperation. But it's not going to be the kind of cheerleader which will jump onto every initiative in order to contain China. India is simply not designed to be that kind of regional power. So it will punch below its weight in many areas. Where it will attempt to punch above its weight is in protecting its national interests, as has happened with this acquisition of Russian oil during the conflict, which has created some controversy in Europe, which, by the way, I'm fully supportive of India's position, given Europe's reckless abandon, which it is still acquiring Russian natural gas and oil. So, can the U.S. count on in a future putative conflict involving Taiwan? Can the U.S. count on India to come to the rescue in some fashion? I think India is going to be very ambivalent about this in any scenario building. In a real conflict, of course, I mean, if China indeed invades Taiwan, then all bets are off for the rest of Asia. And that Asia is going to be very different from the Asia of today. So India will make calculated choices at that stage. But until then, I think it's going to be a more cautious player on the global stage.
Indeed, in the economic front, in the trade and investment economic front, just a couple of years ago, we saw India withdraw from the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership trade deal that was being shaped by China and ASEAN. And many thought that, well, India was just not ready for prime time, if you will, to make the commitments that would be needed for that. And I know there are a number of countries that have wanted to conclude free trade arrangements, bilateral free trade arrangements with India, but the negotiations have been drawn out for years and years, and sometimes over decades and longer. And this is perhaps given the impression that India just is not ready for those kinds of commitments, to be that outward looking and ready to, even on the economic front, where it would make a lot of sense to commit. And indeed, within the context of the World Trade Organization, sometimes India is seen as the spoiler for some of the trade agreements that have been forged or not forged. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I'm inclined to defend India's position on trade. You're absolutely right. I think on RCEP, there was a lot of unhappiness, particularly within ASEAN, because they would have, India's withdrawal from negotiations really created the impression that RCEP was all about China. But indeed, if you look at the details of the agreement, it's more of validating the free trade relationship that ASEAN already enjoyed with China through a bilateral free trade agreement, with the added benefit of bringing in Japan and Korea, and India's inclusion in that would have created this genuine region-wide free trade agreement. But I think if you look at India's track record more recently, and I've been quite impressed with the fact that India is willing to negotiate what it describes as early harvest free trade agreements with a number of countries. And there's Australia, Korea, there's the UK, where the philosophy is let's get things that we agree on on the trading side. Let's ratify those, and then let's negotiate the more troublesome parts, which really creates a runway for a full-blown free trade agreement in a few years' time. And I think that's a very, very pragmatic approach the government has taken. Even in the recent WTO negotiations, where you now have kind of a deal on fishing and other troublesome aspects of the global free trade, I think there was a sense going into those talks that India would be the obstacle. But India negotiated hard, as is the right of every country. And you now, for the first time in a long, long time, you actually have a WTO system which is able to deliver multilateral results. And India may well have, in the past, chosen to obstruct that. The fact that it went along with some conditions, I think, is a hopeful sign. So I think India's, if you look at the expansion of Indian trade over the last decade, I think no business group would simply like the government from being obstructionist in signing some of these free trade agreements. I think business is quite keen on expansion of those trade rights, and India's trade balance signifies that while it's not in the same league as China, China is far, far ahead on this front. India still is building a reasonable trade base, which a lot of people in the country would like that to continue. So that probably explains this early harvest approach.
Right. Which makes a lot of sense. Now, but getting back to the strategic sort of issues, do you think India should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
I mean, the answer instinctively would be yes, but then you get into the footnotes and the annexes and the margins of any of these, gigantic agreements that will see India, Japan, and perhaps Germany. Right. So let's face it: the current global security system is completely inequitable. It's not sustainable if all countries believe that you need to be inclusive, that you need to include voices of countries, both in terms of size of population, in terms of economic weight, in terms of their strategic location in the world, then India certainly qualifies to be. And I think India would India's played this very, very cautious role, as I explained before.
Right.
Perhaps a seat on the UN Security Council will remove some of that shackles and hesitation for India to play a more, and India is a democracy, and hopefully it will remain one, is the perfect, when you think of Africa and China, for example, the entire expansion in Africa, China, trade and investment. But we speak to an African policymaker, as I have done in many, many countries, and you ask them, which country do you regard as a model for your development? And majority of them will say India, because India's navigation of the social, economic, political issues resonates in less developed countries in Africa. So India and many countries can be a model the fact that in more recent years, it is seeking to diminish its own global reputation is incredibly sad.
Right. You were a journalist, so I think it would be remiss of me not to ask you about your thoughts on the state of journalism and freedom of expression today in India. Tell us what your thoughts are, because this has become, of course, in a number of democracies around the region, we've seen how even in those kinds of more open societies, you still see um, um, authoritarian tendencies, at least when it's when leaders, strong leaders in particular, are dealing with the press.
I mean, let's face it, India is no longer a free society under this government. India has all the, it certainly has the official legislative framework to be a democracy. Media nominally has the power to rail against the government in power in the editorial pages and in mainstream television. But those powers, that influence is being circumscribed over the past few years. Where, I mean, if you reflect a little bit about how the ruling party has consolidated its hold over media, but they've very much used the Putin model of what President Putin did when he became president in the late 1990s, in essentially consolidating state control over media. And what's happening in India is it is not state control. It is still privately controlled media interests who are increasingly under the thumb of the government. And the space for genuine, in a democracy, there always needs to be a huge space for debate, dialogue, and dissent. That space has shrunk dramatically. And, all the criticism leveled against India for not living up to its ideals, I think are justified. But there are still brave souls out there, and I think we should continue to reflect that while the government is doing everything it possibly can to control the levers of media, to constrain free speech, anyone who speaks against the government is portrayed as being anti-national. This, of course, brings up memories of the 1930s in a large European country. All of this has not limited a small group of incredibly brave, journalists, advocates of free speech, leaders of NGOs, human rights advocates, from speaking up. And there are still islands of excellence, journalistic excellence in Indian media, where you can still read incredibly balanced, incredibly insightful analysis of what is actually happening in the country. So the government is not able to completely shut down dissent and free speech for reasons which has a lot to do with the nature of India itself. Very, very hard to constrain everyone and to almost have a Stalin-esque kind of polity, which the government certainly would like to have everyone being cheerleading at all times. And since you've got this broad public support, it's very hard for these dissenting voices to be noticed. But they're being noticed within the country, and hopefully they'll continue. I mean, it's easy for me to say, wish them all the best. I'm sitting in the comforts of a country where free speech is allowed, right? So I recognize the irony of what I'm saying. But I really salute all of them.
Although, of course, the US has its own problems, but we won't get into those.
Right? So it's another polarized democracy. But I salute Caravan magazine, the Rana Ayubs of the world, Akash Patel, formerly of Amnesty International. These are the brave souls who are keeping the torch of Indian democracy alive.
So, if a young Indian in America and the US were to come up to you and say, should I go back? And I'm having a good career here in the United States, but should I go back to India, or should I go back to where my parents come from? And because India will still go places in 25 years, another 25 years when it hits the centenary, that there are opportunities. What would you advise? Would you say, well, go for it?
Yeah, two things have happened which gives me pause. For a long period of time. So if you look at India's economic opening up was 1991. So at least until 2015, 2016, I had a clear sense that the best place to be for a young person of Indian origin, and indeed for Indians studying overseas, was to be back home, because you had this, economic growth was 8%. There was tremendous opportunity. More recently, economic opportunity has shrunk. And I think more worryingly, you're seeing a lot of young Indians within India who are leaving. And I think the pandemic has been a major shock to many young people in terms of, I think they're seeing for the first time the state's inability to deliver good governance, which was Mr. Modi's mantra when he was elected to power in 2014. So, which is really, really worrying for India, because India needs the energies and enthusiasm of this young population to remain in the country and to contribute. And I think under the right circumstances, when economic opportunity expands, when the government in power, whichever party it belongs to, gets back to its main business of delivering opportunity for people rather than focusing on identity politics, India would be the perfect place to be in. Because I think compared with almost any other emerging market country, this country has tremendous potential, can still grow at 8-9%, can be a tiger-like economy, but it's been completely shackled by politics and economic thinking of this government, which is really, it's really disappointing to see India underperform, right? So my plea, if any young person should ask me, the question is to go and see for themselves. I think even in this rather bleak scenario which I've painted, I'm sure there are opportunities for young people to build businesses and contribute to the country's economic journey.
Vasuki, this has been really quite enlightening for me. I'm very pleased and honored that you share your insights about your native country, about India at this time. And I think people are fascinated by this country and will continue to be for a long time, especially given its size, the number of people in the country, and as well its growing influence in the world. So thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Al. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
And thank you very much. So I commend to our readers Vasuki's books, the one on Resurgence in Indonesia and Has Asia Lost It? These are really excellent reads and quite insightful books. And please look up Vasuki's articles on AsiaGlobal Online, which are also very much insightful and articles that we're very pleased to publish. So thank you, Vasuki, and thank you all.